Alright, so today I've got the definitive 10 best cards of Shadows of the Galaxy. This will likely be the whole true for the duration of the set. I have no hesitation in saying that. But yeah, so what I'm going to do is give you 10 best cards, also some honorable mentions. But the important part is really what I say about the cards. As always, I'm going to give information about how these cards are playing for me. Hopefully guide you in how to use them and what kind of decks you should be building with them. Just a little disclaimer here. No leaders or bases. I'm not ranking them. You can check out the leader tier list I did a few weeks ago if you want some more information about the 18 new leaders in the set. It's also not going to be a list about play rate. For instance, in set 1, probably one of the most played cards was something like Open Fire, maybe Takedown. Neither of those cards would have made my top 10 when it comes to like their actual power levels. So I'm not just putting a list of the cards I think are going to see the most play. Additionally, this isn't really about the meta, although decks that I think are good are definitely going to bias my opinions about cards, right? Because cards in decks that I think are good generally will be cards that I think are good. But I'm going to try not to just like make this a list about like, oh, these are the 5 cards that are going to be in like a good Boba Fett deck or in a good control deck or something, and just like thus they are the best cards in the set. So I'm going to do my best to not bias towards that. And finally, I'm not rating reprints. Super Laser Tech was printed in this set. It would be a top 10 card in my opinion. It's not going to be on this list. None of the other reprints will be either. All right, let's start with honorable mentions. So I've got Bounty Hunter's Quarry, and to the right of the Hotshot Blaster, Enticing Reward. These are 2 bounties that I've put on this list. I think they are like far and away the best bounty. It's not actually even close. Like the 3rd best bounty is infinitely worse than either of these bounties. If bounties in general are going to be good, it's in large part because these cards are good. So first, Bounty Hunter's Quarry, right? This is a 1-cost card that gives you a 3-cost unit. So it cheats mana twice, cheats resources twice. That's incredibly powerful, right? The downside here is that you have to find a way to kill the unit. Now, bounties, for me, have been really good only in Bosk. The yellow one, we'll talk about that one in a second, but the like main pool of bounties I felt a little clunky to me outside of Bosk, but that's because Bosk can basically use his pinging to eliminate a lot of the downside of bounties, which is that you often need to use a card to kill the unit that you put the bounty on, or you need to use some attack to kill the unit. Bosk makes it very clean. Additionally, this Bounty Hunter's Quarry triggering twice with Bosk is absolute lunacy. I think this card might be good enough to see play outside of Bosk. Most of the bounties I don't think are good enough to see play out of Bosk. But yeah, Bounty Hunter Quarry is fantastic. Enticing Reward, just different. I don't think that one really needs to be that much of a boss thing. I think it's just mostly a control card for like blue-yellow control decks, because it searches so deep into your deck and gives you card advantage as long as you're putting it on a unique unit. But even if you don't, being able to filter so many cards to get 2 events is pretty huge. And yeah, I think just being able, actually it's not just events, right? It's non-units, but being able to use that to basically like search up 2 of the most important events at any given time is going to be very powerful in these control decks. And I think the card deserves a mention here. Hotshot Blaster is another one now. Although at first when I was testing, this was like a 3 of in every yellow deck. It has come down in numbers for me. It is a good tool to have access to in a lot of decks, but it's not something I'm so keen on just like jamming a ton of. It's still not a great rate when you play it, although anytime you can sneak damage in is very strong. I think the card will see a decent amount of play just because of that smuggle, right? You're not spending a card. It's very powerful. Kylo's Tie. This is not a very like attractive pick, right? That basically I'm ignoring the text on it. It's a 2-cost 3/2 space unit, which is just strong. It has no downside. It's gonna get played in red villain decks. It's an important card. Its stocks went down a little bit when Daring Raid got spoiled, but in general, It's just a powerful unit, and it also works well with like random discard effects, like if they cunning discard you, or some other random stuff like pillage. If that gets played a lot out of these like Ray decks, having Kylo's tie is pretty nice to throw to that. Next, Lurking Tie. I think recently this card has seen an uptick in like discourse around it. The card is annoying to deal with. Really, two main things, right? You having another space unit is a good way to deal with it because it's a 2/2, and then card like make an opening, right? But what's going on now is that Lurking Tie is giving people a little bit of a window to interact with it, but if this card gets buffed, it is Imperial, right? So things like Tarkin Leader, Tie Advanced can buff it, and then once it's buffed and it can't like really trade profitably into it with a unit, that can be a huge problem. It poses a big enough clock, right? It hits for 4 if it's buffed even more, that you don't get a lot of time to interact with it, and it needs like a very specific interaction. I think my initial impression of this card was not as high as I am on it now. I do still think there's like a pretty big downside to the fact that like if people just start jamming more space units, like Inferno 4 out of blue villain decks, right? It's a 2/3 that can play a turn before this. You really can't play the Lurking Tie anymore, and there's going to be just a lot of other units that can do that. But if you find the right timing for this card to get it into play, if their opponent has neglected space, or if you're able to like play it and then buff it outside of like combat removal range, then it's going to be really strong. And last honorable mention for me is Dark Saber. I still think this isn't going to see like much play outside of like a Sabine deck, but having the option to Dark Saber up a Sabine on turn 3 can really put a lot of decks on. Well, a lot of decks just won't be able to deal with that, right? They'll just lose to that play if they weren't prepared for it. And because of that, I think just like the ceiling on it is very high. Obviously, the floor on it is also pretty low, but you're not just going to like jam it and pray. You're going to find your opening for it if you can slam this and get this equipped onto Sabine. I think there's also a chance that maybe some other leaders just will use it. The fact that it can be searched up by the card Commission because it's an item means that you can kind of like splash this as a one of in a lot of decks just to like have that out. Like, oh, I'll just, throw one of these. Sometimes I'll be able to draw it at the exact opportune moment because I can play this Commission card and search 10 for it. And I think that adds a little bit of upside to it as well. All right, let's get into the actual top 10. Number 10 is Bo-Katan Kryze, and this is kind of like my example of Rule 3 that I said, which was it's not going to be a list based on what my expected meta will be. I don't know if Mono Red is going to be good enough. I do think there's a very good Mono Red deck right now, and I made a video on it, Mono Red Han, and I think I'm going to continue working on that deck because I think it has actual legs. But there's no guarantee that Bo-Katan is going to see a lot of widespread play simply because she's only good in Mono Red, and if Mono Red doesn't end up being a huge meta presence, then this won't see that much play. But this is a 3/3 for 2, right? The floor here is 3/3 for 2. Like Battlefield Marine was like one of the best 2-drops in the game in the first set. And then like, have you read the text here? When defeated, like this can draw you 2 cards when it dies. That's insane. It can draw you 1, 2, can draw you 0, right? Like that's the floor, but the floor is so high that the ceiling goes even higher, right? This card's really strong. It's a big reason to be playing Mono Red. So we'll see if this card becomes as popular as its power level suggests it should. All right, number 9 is Punishing One. So this 3/4 ship for 3, right? That's big and that's strong. So again, this is another one where the floor is just really high. It has Underworld trait, which works with a bunch of stuff like Cat Bane and McClunky. But the text here is also kind of crazy, especially in like bounty decks where you're like putting bounties on stuff and then you can get extra attacks out of your Punishing One. It's kind of a package that kind of really takes this Punishing One through the roof in terms of value. So look out for like whether or not a bounty deck becomes popular. Bosk obviously would be the first place to look for such synergy. But even outside of like bounty-centric decks, this is a card that I think can see play. Like I just talked about a yellow GI deck that played 0 bounties, and I was running this because it worked with him, and just having access to like more good early space units is strong, right? 7th Fleet Defender kind of held that crown for set 1, but we're getting more options. And right, 3-4 versus 7th Fleet 3-2 with the shield, right? There's times where just this is better, right? Against Make opening, 7th Fleet gets cleanly answered, Punishing One doesn't. So Punishing One's floor, again, very high, ceiling even higher if you're playing against if you have bounties, but also your opponents might be playing like upgraded units, right? Experience. If you kill something that has experience, this readies. If you killed something that has a shield through the shield, this readies. So getting sneaky damage in with Punishing One is going to be a thing that I expect to see a lot of. All right, number 8, Krayt Dragon. Some people I think might actually have this a bit higher. I think it's a very good finisher, but I still don't think it's just like the instant win card that maybe it's being considered as. But this being in red gives red an option to do something that it didn't have before, because I thought generally it didn't have great top end for dealing with control decks, and Krayt Dragon really is what's filling that role now. It's at its best against control decks where you can just play it, and then no matter what they do, something bad is happening to them. And then if they can't immediately answer it, right, it's a 10 power unit. It's going to end the game very quickly. I think this works even better in like a Han deck, right? Because Han could cheat this out at 8. Who cares that it only has 8 health at that point? This guy's health is mostly irrelevant. And yeah, I think the card is going to see a decent amount of play. I don't expect it to be like a 3 of everywhere or even anywhere. Maybe in like sideboard included, it'll get seen play as like more 3 of, but it's something that's going to have to be considered by a lot of decks. Like, how do I win once they land a Krayt? If it's impossible, then how do I win before they land a Krayt? All right, number 7 is Toro Calican. I don't even remember this character from the show, but here he is, being one of the best cards in the set. Again, another one where I'll say the floor is high as a 3-cost 3/5. It has the Bounty Hunter trait, which mostly matters because of the text on himself, so it's not really triggering himself. But when you play another Bounty Hunter unit, this gets readied, right? There's just a lot of good Bounty Hunter units in a variety of decks, right? You can play Boba unit, you can play things like Forlom and Zuckuss. There's the cheap 1/2 neutral unit. There's Dengar. There's a bunch, right? Even Greedo, although Greedo dies to Toro's trigger, so it's not my favorite synergy. But even getting one ready off of this guy is already crazy value. The fact that he's neutral villain, like, I'm gonna bump him up in points that, although I said like play rate wasn't gonna be a huge consideration, this guy can fit in so many different shells that I just kind of assume it's going to get played somewhere and be good because it can go in any villain deck. But yeah, he can sneak a bunch of damage in. If you pump this guy, he can still get readied, right? So you can think of like putting a Hotshot Blaster on him, playing a Bounty Hunter. Now you can hit for 5 again. Doing something with Cunning, for instance, in a mono yellow deck where you pump him by 4 and then play another Bounty Hunter after. Hit for 7 twice. I just think, because again the floor is so high as the unit is already at a premium stat line, adding that extra text is going to make Toro very popular. All right, number 6, Lone Pike. Now this is one that I don't think you'll see in a lot of top 10 lists or even talked about that much, which is weird to me, right? Like, I think the text on this might have like misled people into lowering the value of this, because even if it didn't have that on attack, it's a 4-cost 4/6. That's premium. And then it has the Smuggle, which is like crazy, right? This card doesn't cost you a card when you play it for 5 from your resource row. I actually think this on attack trigger is even better than people are realizing, because of the fact that, first of all, you're usually tossing this on something in a different arena. So either it gets a clean attack because it shields itself, or you can attack, kill something, shield something else that's important of yours, and then throw a shield on a meaningless unit, like a super laser tech on the other side, or some random space unit that you weren't going to deal with combat damage anyway, right? Blue Villain is the best color at dealing with shielded units because they have Make an Opening, they have Takedown, they have Fell the Dragon, they have Vanquish, Rivals Fall, Super Laser Blast, right? Like, shields kind of don't matter to blue villain. It's a big perk of being in blue villain. So that downside is often kind of irrelevant. On top of that, if you're playing with something like Kira, her flip can delete the shield that Pike put on something. The shields itself work well with her in general because she can, if you have a shield on one of your own units, she can heal that unit to full and then remove that shield. But even outside of Kira, right, I think this card is pretty strong. Smuggle on a 4/6, huge value, right? Like, that's for late game attrition, but this is such a good rate on the smuggle, like better than most smuggle rates. Lone Pike should be getting more love, and that's why I've stuck him up here so that I can talk about him and get on my high horse about why this card is good. All right, number 5, Maul. He's big, he hits hard, he kills your opponent, can delete most leaders. It's strong. The upside here of also like being able to protect himself if you have underworld units. There's a lot of underworld synergy in this set. I think both green has them, red has them, yellow has them, even blue, right? This card is good. Now, I will add a little caveat here that I'm not sure it's going to see as much play as like its power warrants simply because of Darth Vader. Now, I don't want to just like, oh, they're both 7 and they're both ambush and they're both units in green villain, so they're the same. But like in a lot of ways, they are very similar. And Vader is the better card. I'm like pretty certain of that. So there are going to be some situations where you'd prefer Maul. Obviously, Maul offers something for aggressive decks that Vader cannot, which is immediate damage. And I think that's going to be the first place you're going to look at including Maul instead of Vader. But because Vader in most wide situations is better, the question is, like, do you go 3 Vader plus some Mauls? Are you trimming Vaders at all? I think usually no to the latter, right? I don't think you're usually trimming Vaders out of most decks, so maybe you're adding some more. But then how many 7 drops are going to be good? Well, that's something to figure out the minutia of in like more deep testing. I think you should look at including Maul specifically in aggressive decks. So even something like Boba Green from the previous set might have liked Maul over Vader just to use it as a finisher. Right now with like boss decks, I think you can look at Maul. I think you can look at Maul not so much in control shells because I think Vader is just slam dunk better in those decks. So yeah, just play around with this, but keep in mind that its play rate might not be as high as it would have been if Darth Vader did not exist at all. All right, number 4, Wrecker. So Wrecker's huge. Wrecker kills something when he comes into play. He demands an immediate answer because like you can't even like chump with Sentinels. It's got Overwhelm. Yeah, like there's not much negative here. The fact that he costs 6 means it also works with Energy Conversion Lab. It works with timely reinforcement. Is it reinforcements? The green card that gives ambush, right? Like Wrecker with ambush is nuts. You can do like the 5 to something, and if it doesn't die, you actually get like 5 extra overwhelm damage. So that holds really true with like 6 health units, right? Especially some Sentinels that exist, Obi-Wan, Mandalorian. But yeah, like this is a big guy, and he deletes something, and like I think the decks that are going to play him are not too concerned about their curve after him. And I think you can actually include bigger units. Like if you're going to play red and then you also have crate dragons in your deck, well, the crates are probably better against like something else, right? Against like control decks where you maybe don't need to be blowing up your own resources to defeat units. And maybe you're just going to like play Wrecker as a 6-cost 7/6 and like not even use the ability. It also works well outside in like Han decks where you can play him as a 5-cost unit as long as you're like okay either not deploying your leader or playing it after you deploy your leader. But yeah, Wrecker's going to see a lot of play. There's just no way he doesn't. And he's going to be very good kind of like at base. All right, number 3, Bazine Nal. I think this card is played very well. I think just that disruption is so clutch in so many cases. It's a cheap unit. It fits into a lot of curves. Smuggle obviously gives it a whole new level of upside where it doesn't cost you a card. And I think you also need to be like okay with just like not making your opponent discard sometimes, right? They're still drawing, right? So if you know you can deal with what's in their hand, or what's in their hand isn't like incredibly scary, then you're just chill with playing it, right? The stats aren't very good, but it's still a unit in play, which means it can carry things like hot drop blasters. It can be used with surprise strike. Like, it's still a threat to deal damage. So your opponent sometimes has to decide if they want to even waste time interacting with it. But that gives you more units, which means more action churning, right? Like, it's still a unit that you'll be able to attack with for one, just to like pass an action. So don't get too caught up in the bad stats. They aren't very good, but it's still not even a terrible turn one play. Sometimes you can even snipe the opponent's turn one play or snipe their turn two play and potentially leave them in awkward situations. But yeah, like the key parts here is that it can like really brick a turn for your opponent by ripping out something very important, like the barrage that they need to play, the super laser blast they need to play, the only unit that they can play that turn, right? There's just a lot of situations where this can squeeze in to your curve and really be incredibly disruptive. I think this card is going to see a lot of play, and I think it's one of the better cards in the set. All right, number 2, we've got Snoke. So this guy, I mean, this is a real big stabilizer in blue villain. I think that -2/-2 might not read as that impressive, but it's very, very strong. It kills a lot of important units that need to be killed, things like 7th Fleet Defender, Crafty Smugglers, things that have been wounded and weren't finished off. Anything that isn't killed is immediately not hitting you very hard because of the -2. Like, think about like units that are normally really scary, like Ruthless Raider. It now hits you for 2. It's not that scary anymore. Supreme Leader, when it comes into play, is going to prevent a bunch of damage coming your way. It's also going to mean that your opponent's units out of hand are affected, right? That Vader that they were going to play now only ambushes for 3. That Maul can't actually kill this out of hand, right? It only ambushes for 5. Snoke is tough to kill for unit-based decks because the units are what they would use for removal, and he's shrinking all of them. Snoke's a big deal. I think it's going to be a very important card in this format because I still think blue villain control is going to be one of the best decks, and Snoke is giving them a tool that they didn't really have access to, which is like wide board presence. These decks needed, outside of Super Laser Blast, to basically trade on 1-for-1, and Supreme Leader not only can trade at a better rate than that, but he can also just be like mitigation in a way that most cards can't handle, or most decks might not be able to handle, I should say. So yeah, he may be narrow and he may only see play in a very specific archetype, but he's a big deal, and a lot of decks need to be prepared for answers for this guy, or they're gonna just basically lose on the spot. All right. The number 1 might not be the most exciting pick. This might be a lot of people's number 1 card. Poe is really, really good. He's a 5-cost 6/6, which even without immediate impact has been basically good enough to not instantly die or require like your opponent to go through a lot of work to get him off the board the turn you play him. But even more so, right? He's one of the best ambush targets in the game now. He can hit for 8 because of his deal 2. So we're done with Steadfast Battalions, I think, for the most part, especially in decks that can play Poe. But I hope so in a lot of other decks too. But Poe can now one-shot most leaders with an ambush. Even without an ambush, it's going to be hard for them to deploy if they can't kill Poe immediately. He's got like Defeat and Upgrade, right? That's like a hugely important ability that's not going to be used very much, but is going to make some like really, it's going to like help clean up a lot of things for hero decks. I think like 7th Fleet Defender, for instance, right? You can discard 2 cards. Now it's not great, but if you have to do that, but it can be, right? Discard 2 cards to kill that 7th Fleet by killing the base and dealing the shield and dealing 2. Can defeat a bunch of equipment, right? Dark Sabers, bounties. Poe is just, that ability is going to be really, really useful when it's useful, which might not be all the time, but I think it'll be very impactful when you use it. The discard ability, again, that's mostly for control decks, so if they can't immediately answer this, you're going to gladly trade a card in your hand for a card in their hand. And yeah, it hits for 6. It's so big. It's 5. You play it with Energy Conversion Lab. The amount of value you can get from that ambush is incredible. If you play this out of like a Han deck where you can play it for 4 cost, this is 6/4. That's also very, very powerful. Obviously, it can be answered more cleanly there, but if you can squeeze that in on turn 3 and they can't immediately answer it, it means you're going to get that attack, or you're going to force them to jump through a bunch of hoops on turn 3 just to get it off the board, meaning a clean turn 4 for your Han deck. I think you could play it outside of ambush, and I think you could probably play it outside of Han too, even if you're playing old school Han and not even ramping, but you can get him out on turn 3 in those decks also, and he's a 6/6. And then, yeah, look at playing him fair also. I don't think that wouldn't be the first place I would look, like a deck that can't ambush or cheat him out. That wouldn't be the first place I'd look to playing Poe, like Rey, for instance, like blue, red Rey right now. I think that deck gets played a lot. I'm not sure Poe's actually any good in that deck because, again, it still might not be good enough as a 5-cost do-nothing. So if you're not ramping or ambushing, maybe he's not good enough. But because of how good he is in those 2 situations, when you ramp or ambush, I think Poe is going to be an absolute all-star. I think he's going to be the most expensive card in the set as well. So, yeah, play some Poe. Remember, top 4 card was also a Wrecker, so, you know, red Hero has these really chunky beaters, and I think there's going to be some good shells that involve those 2 cards. All right, that's the end. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments. Please subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel out. And until next time, take care.